an order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. It mandates that federal agencies recognize only two unchangeable genders, male and female. It directs the Department of Education to enforce Title IX in a way that prohibits transgender women from participating in women's sport and threatens schools and organizations with loss of funding if they don't comply. The order also instructs the Department of Homeland Security to deny visas to transgender female athletes wishing to compete in the United States. And perhaps most importantly, it restricts federal funding for gender affirming care. There are legal challenges swirling around this, but it has also heightened concerns about a loss of rights among transgender people, and because data shows that violent rhetoric often has real-world consequences, there are increased concerns about personal safety. We will spend the hour talking about this order, further legislation in the pipeline, and the impact of it all, with Ames Simmons, Senior Lecturing Fellow at Duke University Law School and former Policy Director for the National Center for Transgender Equality and Equality NC. He is here along with Sarah Mikhail, CEO of Time Out Youth, which provides programs and services to LGBTQ plus young people and their allies. And Orion Rummler is the LGBTQ plus reporter for the 19th News. That's an independent nonprofit newsroom reporting on gender, politics, and policy. Welcome to you all. Good morning.
Good morning.
Ames, good morning. I'm going to start with you, Ames. I referenced this executive order that Donald Trump signed on day one, but there have been others, including one that asserts, quote, medical professionals are maiming and sterilizing a growing number of impressionable children under the radical and false claim that adults can change a child's sex. That's verbatim from the order. This is an about-face from the Biden administration and a much stronger approach than was taken during the first Trump administration. Researchers estimate that less than 1% of adults identify as transgender. About 1.6 million adults over 18, about 0.6% under 18. A tiny, tiny fraction of people in the population. Do you understand the reason for this, what people have said is an attack on such a tiny minority of people, and did you see it coming?
I definitely think that we saw this coming based on the campaign trail, these same inflammatory statements that Trump made in these executive orders. Many of them he broadcast on the campaign trail. They were also featured in Project 2025, which, again, during the campaign, Trump tried to distance himself and say he didn't know any of these people. But of course, many of them were in his former administration, and many of them are back in his second administration. Just thinking about Russell Vogt, for example, at the Office of Management and Budget, that's a non-sexy title for somebody who has a lot of impact on how the federal government spends money. So I definitely, I'm not surprised by this. I think that the Trump campaign believes that this is some misguided way to connect with his base, to mobilize people who feel disenfranchised in our country, although I don't think that that's had the intended effect. I think the majority of people think that trans people should be able to get the medical care that we need, just like everybody else.
Russell Vogt, the person you just mentioned as the head of the Office of Management and Budget, is allegedly one of the principal authors of Project 2025. And I don't know whether the language in the executive order, Sarah, that I just quoted that says medical professionals are maiming and sterilizing a growing number of impressionable children, I don't know if that language is in Project 2025, but the use of words like maiming and calling transgender people mutilated, as he does, is deliberate. What is the effect? And you can all unmute yourselves. Otherwise, we'll be playing unmute your mic all during the program. There's no barking dogs. There's no crying babies. Just unmute yourselves. Go ahead, Sarah. I'm sorry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. The language is having such an impact on young people. And I'll say that even before Project 2025, the rhetoric around trans people, particularly in North Carolina, for the last few years has had an impact on young people. And when I say impact on their mental health, I don't mean that they're a little sad. I mean, this is life and death. Trans young people already are twice as more likely than even their LGBT peers to attempt to take their own life. So the political climate telling them that it is mutilating to become who they are with the support of their families and their doctors. I think that language is fear-mongering because it assumes and creates an image that young people can walk into a doctor's office. They're portraying images of 8-year-olds going in and getting mutilated in this way, rather than what I'm seeing, which is wonderful, loving families saying, I've known my child since they were young and I want them to be who they are. With a medical doctor, every medical professional and every association supports gender affirming care for all trans people, particularly young people. So the impact is not just on their mental health and the trauma of living in this climate, but blocking them from becoming who they are in really impressionable times. So I think that this is far reaching and insidious, and it really scares me for our young people around the country, particularly our youth who already had this impact when we had our own bills passed and our own legislation just 2 years ago.
This change in approach towards transgender people politically within the Trump administration is also working to eradicate references to transgender people, erasing them essentially from they're trying to erase history, but they're also trying to erase the present. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission announced that it would remove identity pronouns from employees' online profiles, saying, quote, biology is not bigotry. Biological sex is real and it matters. But if you are transitioning, Ames, or have already transitioned, what is the reality and how harmful is the removal of you and your pronouns from these government websites?
I think we shouldn't allow it to go uncontested that they might be trying to erase trans and non-binary people, but we have always existed and we will continue to exist regardless of how difficult the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission makes it for us to file employment discrimination claims. I don't mean to downplay the importance of this removal of trans from even the LGBTQ acronym, the way that the government is using it. But in terms of employment discrimination, people will still have the right to pursue federal claims of employment discrimination. Federal courts have upheld the right of trans and non-binary workers to have a place to work that is free from discrimination.
Orion, it seems Orwellian in a way to have the U.S. Employment Opportunity Commission, which tries to work toward lack of discrimination in employment, remove these labels for transgender people and therefore protections against discrimination. Do other people see it that way? Or is this just seen as something else?
Well, the EEOC taking this step aligns with the first executive order you spoke about from Trump on trans people, because that first executive order, the purpose of that EO was to broadly say, under the view of this administration, trans and non-binary people do not exist. Fundamentally, the federal government is hostile to their identities. So federal agencies have received that message of this is how they should act in according to what the administration believes. I mean, in terms of how LGBTQ people are responding to the erasure you're talking about, most recently, I think someone else just mentioned this, maybe Ames. Recently, there have been days of protest outside Stonewall because the National Park Service removed all mention of trans people from their website mentioning Stonewall, which is erasing history in a very literal sense because trans people were why Stonewall happened in the first place. So people are responding pretty strongly to these moves by the federal government to erase trans people, including from websites like the CDC and HHS, although one of the lawsuits against the administration has forced the return of a lot of that information on health websites.
I mean, the real world consequences are wide ranging to this, and probably, and many people haven't even considered many of them because it would never cross their minds. Because Trump has ordered the State Department to stop granting requests for new and updated passports with gender markers other than M for male, F for female. The option to choose X for those who identify with neither was removed. And Orion, you report that, quote, inaccurate identity documents expose trans people to harassment and can hinder travel, especially without access to a passport that matches their actual physical appearance. Like so many things happening in this blitzkrieg of executive orders that the Trump administration has issued, this seems to have been ordered with very little, if any, attention to detail or the realities on the ground. Has this already caused problems? And when it does, how will they deal with it?
Now, this policy in particular has been very chaotic. As far as I'm still aware, there's still not a formal policy from the State Department on this. This has been something communicated in leaked emails from Secretary of State Rubio and statements from the agency to reporters. But trans people across the country have been deeply confused on what will happen if they attempt to get a passport that matches their gender expression. Like what we're talking about is you meet someone on the street and she's a woman and she has a piece of paper that says male on it, when to anyone alive, she looks like a woman. So and that's where the harassment and discrimination comes in, because you're just effectively carrying a piece of documentation that outs you as trans to any official you'd need to present that documentation to. The way this has been chaotic is that some folks, including trans people in one of the many lawsuits against the Trump administration, have said, and I interviewed one of these folks, have said that in addition, so a lot of folks are getting passports back that have the wrong gender marker on them. This was kind of expected. What was not expected at all is that some people have, they haven't gotten any passport back or supporting documents. I spoke with one gentleman in West Virginia who lost access to his marriage license, his birth certificate, and his passport when he submitted them. So there's been a lot of chaos for folks on this.
We have to take a break. There's more to talk about with regard to that and other things in just a moment. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Wednesday on Charlotte Talks, among the changes brought on by the second Trump administration is the disappearance of guidance from the CDC and other federal agencies. Doctors say they use these tools to keep us healthy. We hear from local medical officials about what they'll have to do to adapt tomorrow at 9 a.m. on WFAE.
I'm Robin Young. A new study shows some people are so addicted to cannabis they can't stop despite being ill and even facing death. One problem, the drug's potency.
The cannabis that was around in the 1970s had around 1 to 2% THC. And if you look at what's actually being sold, you have 25 to 30% THC.
Next time, Here and Now.
You can catch Here and Now today at noon on WFAE, where support comes from the Southern Environmental Law Center, dedicated to finding solutions to the toughest environmental challenges, starting here in the South. To learn more about how SELC is working to make a difference here in North Carolina and beyond, visit southernenvironment.org. And by the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, hosting the CEO Impact Awards on March 12th at the Ritz-Carlton Charlotte. Tickets and more information at events.tmcf.org/Impact Awards. Support also comes from listeners just like you.
It's Charlotte Talks on Listener Funded 90.7 WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about transgender rights and possible discrimination against them as a result of a series of executive orders issued in the first month and beginning on day one of the Trump administration. Ames Simmons is with us. He is a senior lecturing fellow at the Duke University School of Law. Sarah Mikhail is CEO of Time Out Youth, which is a local advocacy group for young people who are exploring their sense of self and who they are. And Orion Rummler is an LGBTQ plus reporter for the 19th News. There are facts and then there are opinions. And in the last Trump administration, facts seem to take a back seat. And it seems to be happening again, because there are things on the ground that you simply cannot change, even if you want to. Trump has also called on government agencies to stop using taxpayer money to promote what it calls gender ideology. And they have removed, as Ames referred to a moment ago, the TNQ from government websites when mentioning LGBTQ issues. It's now just LGB. Orion, this is similar to renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. And the AP has been shuttled off the White House grounds because they are going to stick with calling it the Gulf of Mexico because there are standards. And you just can't rename something without going through a change at some international level. So they've been, I guess, removed because of that. Is there a risk that if news organizations like your own continue to refer to LGBTQ plus folks as that, as opposed to LGB, that you too will be escorted off the grounds?
Sure, I think it depends on the situation. I mean, if you're a reporter, like the White House press briefing room, the White House obviously can have more control in that arena. But I guess we'll have to wait and see how censorship may look more broadly under the administration. That's something that a lot of media outlets are waiting to see. I'll also note for the policy we're talking about, a federal judge has temporarily blocked this particular policy on withholding federal funding to clinics that provide gender affirming care. This is one of the, I think, 9 lawsuits regarding trans issues only that are ongoing against the administration, and 4 of them have resulted in temporary restraining orders, and this is one of them.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether to ask Ames or Sarah this next question, so I'll ask you both, and I'll start with Ames. I think we should probably spend a moment for those who have difficulty understanding and or accepting transgender individuals. What would you say, Ames, that might help them?
I think one of the first things that's important to do is to pause and take a breath. Reacting in the moment and causing chaos is exactly what this quote unquote shock and awe of this barrage of executive orders was intended to provoke. I think it's important to understand the limitations of what executive orders can do. They're more like a statement of intent by the president that would have to be carried out by regulations that are supposed to follow the APA, the law that governs administrative procedure in our country that includes things like notice and comment about changes to regulations. I think it's especially important for healthcare providers to not react in a knee-jerk fashion. We've seen a small handful of providers of care to young people who want to stop or reevaluate whether this really important care, as Sarah has pointed out, whether this should continue to be provided. And we've not only had attorneys general who have brought lawsuits against this executive order, but we've also seen state attorneys general, notifying some of these providers of their obligations to provide care.
That kind of spoken like a true law professor. That focuses on the law, but let's focus on the individual for a second, Sarah. Well, what would you say to people who don't understand transgender, the concept, maybe don't
Yeah.
believe that it's real. What would you say to help them understand and or accept the
Yeah,
situation?
it's like something you said earlier. This is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of fact. And I don't believe that we have the right to argue whether somebody exists or not. I say this as a cis ally who has spent my career working with LGBTQ young people who have dared to live outside of the expectations that society has put on them, and we are better for it. I think that it's really difficult and harmful to even ask the question of belief around existence because, as Ames said it, trans people have existed before there were words. We've known who we are as a queer community before we were accepted, allowed to get married, all the things that our modern government wants to try to put on a legal chopping block or not, that hasn't changed people's existence. And I'll say that if you spend an hour with trans young people, you'll believe that not only do they exist, they should be able to flourish and have bigger platforms than they do, because there is a resilience that I hate that they have to have, but it really is, I believe, such a fear. I would want to ask that person, what are you afraid of? As a cis woman, my womanhood is not threatened by a trans woman. Nothing about my existence is threatened by trans people. So what are you afraid of? And when the data, if you're also then not an emotional person like me, a social worker who sees this, if you're a data person, the research tells us that people thrive when they're allowed to get healthcare and be who they are. So that could be a compelling point. And if nothing else, you should care that young people should exist. Young people should not be told that they cannot be themselves and turn into thriving adults. And that is what we want. People say it all the time. Trans young people should become trans adults. That's the agenda.
There's a danger to all of this, obviously physical danger, because if you discriminate at the government level against people or groups of people or individuals, you give permission for others to do similar things. But there's also a psychological part of this. UCLA School of Law, using data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System and the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, estimates that nearly 1 in 5 people who identify as transgender are between the ages of 13 and 17, a very impressionable age. When you have someone in the Oval Office who simply dismisses you as a group of people as though you don't exist, Sarah, what message does that send? What message is it sending to the young people with whom you work at Time Out Youth?
Well, I'll share two really upsetting anecdotes. A young person came to our space right after the election and said, "Is it going to be legal for me to live in this country? Can I exist as a human?" And they were speaking about the legality, but the deeper message was, am I okay to be here? Because I heard very clearly that I shouldn't be here. And then another young person, because we work with young people who, regardless of what the government says, have already been marginalized by society for many other reasons. We work with unhoused young people because of systemic poverty and racism. So sometimes the politics don't reach them because they're trying to survive day to day. And then they hear this, and I had a young person who struggles with depression and has for a long time say, I don't want to die, but this is making it very difficult because it is a fight. And so when I say it's life or death, that is not hyperbolic. We truly will lose young people because that political message comes into their homes. 60% of youth, LGBTQ youth, already grow up in non-affirming homes. So now there is a lot more space for their families who might have already been struggling, or their communities, to drive home those points. So that's the real life day to day that I can sit and scroll through the news and think about how to get to work and send the right message, but they need to be able to show up the next day and develop as a human and feel like it's okay to do that.
Orion, you talked about some of these orders being challenged in the courts. Trump has decided to exclude transgender people when enforcing laws to protect against sex discrimination. And that's one of those cases where I think the courts already have made some decisions that might prevent full implementation. But what do you see as you covered these stories as the possible outcome here? Is it likely to be the courts get out of the way, or are they likely to come down on the other side of the Trump administration?
So far, we have 4 cases of judges. In one case, a Reagan appointee issued a temporary restraining order to halt the administration's attempt to prevent federal prisoners from accessing gender-affirming care. We also had a Biden appointee, I think a couple of Biden appointees, but judges halt other cases. And in the case I mentioned earlier about gender-affirming care, that judge, in his comments during the case, he was very clear, and I'm not quoting exactly here, I'm paraphrasing, but that judge said, it appears like the administration is trying to make it that trans people don't exist. The judge was very clear that that is how he saw this policy. So far, we're seeing judges side against the Trump administration for these trans cases, which is not surprising. The past couple of years, we've seen a massive wave of state-level anti-LGBTQ bills, and lower courts stopped a lot of these state bills. It was when they got to circuit courts that it started getting iffy. And that's how we ended up at the Supreme Court with that Tennessee case. But federal district judges are probably going to be pretty wholesale against these efforts. We'll have to see how that changes as they continue to circuit courts. And then, of course, there's the additional fact that the Trump administration has indicated that it is open to ignoring what judges say completely, which I'm not an expert in that area, but that is also something the administration has indicated.
And that would cause a constitutional crisis. Ames Simmons, you're the senior lecturing fellow at the Duke University School of Law. Like so many of the executive orders that Donald Trump has issued on other aspects, not just this, many are questioning both the legality of these orders in some cases and the constitutionality. And I know you don't sit on the United States Supreme Court, and they are the only ones that decide upon the constitutionality of things. What's your take, though?
If we're thinking about the Skermetti case that Orion just brought up, I think the unconstitutionality of Tennessee's law is pretty straightforward, because people are guaranteed the equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment. And when you say that cisgender people can receive care and transgender people cannot receive the same care, that is flat out a sex-based classification that's subject in constitutional law to intermediate scrutiny, where the government would have to show that this policy is substantially related to an important government interest. And there is not an important government interest in preventing trans and non-binary young people from surviving, like Sarah has pointed out.
At Duke, Ames, you teach a course on rethinking gender, and you served as policy director, as I said earlier, at the National Center for Transgender Equality and at Equality NC, among other positions. And as I mentioned, Trump recently ordered gender ideology, his words, removed from government websites. He even had them replace the word gender with the word sex. Gender and sex have similar but different meanings. Sex refers specifically to biological and physiological characteristics, while gender refers to roles and behaviors. It sounds like they're splitting hairs, but what in the real world is the impact of doing that, of splitting those hairs?
I think the most important real world aspect is that it leads ordinary people to question whether they actually have an understanding of who trans and non-binary people are. And, honestly, it may cause even cisgender or non-trans people to think about, like, well, how does my own sex interact with my own gender identity in ways that maybe make some people uncomfortable and play right into these kind of limiting policies that the Trump administration is putting out.
Orion.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. Just speaking of real world impacts of these policies, like Sarah mentioned earlier, for the past couple of years covering anti-LGBTQ state laws, I've spoken with therapists in these states and kids in these states who trans kids start experiencing a lot of suicidality in response to being targeted this way. And it's something that I've seen over and over again. And in Utah, whenever Utah passed their gender affirming care ban, I spoke to a therapist who said 6 of her trans teen clients told her they wanted to die afterwards. So that is the real world impact, is trans kids are being told, I shouldn't exist anymore.
This focus on, I don't know where you are, Orion, but in North Carolina, we spent a lot of time talking about HB2. And this sounds very much like North Carolina's infamous HB2 or bathroom bill that mandated individuals use public restrooms that matched the gender or the sex on their birth certificates. It was a great hue and cry. We lost business, we lost basketball tournaments, we lost a lot of income to the state as a result of it, and ultimately HB2 bit the dust. The Trump policies affect the entire country, not just one state. And not much attention, seems to me, is being paid to this and many other things. In fact, one former Democratic congressman, Tim Ryan from Ohio, said over the weekend that this is not a hill that Democrats should be willing to die on. Democrats were all over HB2. What's the difference?
Well, the difference is that, especially in response to the Trump administration winning after campaigning on anti-trans issues, more Democrats believe, without much real evidence, that taking a step away from supporting trans rights will benefit them politically. And I have to stress, we don't have a lot of evidence to show that that's the case, but we've seen this in a couple of congressional Democrats and then state level Democrats. And one example, I forget his name, but a New Jersey Democrat who supported gay marriage, who's now stepped away from trans rights. And you're right to point out Beal's bathroom example in North Carolina, because there was such a massive outcry politically and also from corporate entities. And I'll also say over the past couple of years, we've seen less and less of that in response to anti-LGBTQ bills, which has been frustrating.
Ames Rummler is an LGBTQ plus reporter for the 19th News. Ames Simmons is a senior lecturing fellow at Duke University School of Law. Sarah Mikhail is the CEO of Time Out Youth. And when we come back, Sarah, I want to talk about something that Orion alluded to a moment ago, and that is the danger involved in all of this with suicidal activities. We're coming right back.
Coming up in 20 minutes, it's 1A. The 2024 election laid bare the weaknesses of the Democratic Party. Moving forward, what is its plan to check what President Trump has planned? Plus, how does it plan to regroup and rebrand for the future? That's at 10 a.m. on WFAE.
I'm Robert Krulwich from Radiolab. We're told that smell triggers memories in the brain. If you're in your car, let's try something. Roll up your windows and inhale. What do you remember? Like the perfume on a certain person, a favorite dog, a diaper moment, perhaps. There are some memories you cherish and others that just linger. How about contributing this barrel of aroma that is your car to your favorite public radio station? And you might even get a tax deduction.
Just head to WFAE.org/cars to get started.
Support comes from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library, serving the university's city community with a variety of resources at its new location, 5528 Waters Edge Village Drive. More information at cmlibrary.org. And by WorkSmart IT, with the goal to help local businesses simplify IT management, including cybersecurity, 24-hour help desk support, and cloud strategy. Tech tips and more at worksmart.com/blog. This is WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on 90.7 WFAE and WFAE.org. I'm Mike Collins. Ames Simmons is with us, Duke University School of Law Senior Lecturing Fellow. Orion Rummler, LGBTQ plus reporter for the 19th News. And Sarah Mikhail, CEO of Time Out Youth. Sarah, Orion alluded to this a minute ago. A leading cause of death among teens in general is intentional self-harm or suicide. We also know that transgender and non-binary individuals, young people, have often considered self-harm at higher rates than other LGBTQ youth. 20% have attempted suicide, according to some studies. This move to restrict transgender rights is coming from the same side of the political spectrum that wants to curtail abortion rights to protect unborn children. These are children who are very much alive. There seems to be a disconnect here. Do you see any way to bridge that?
I appreciate you saying that. It is a really horrible comparison, right, to talk about a group that claims to be pro-life but does not do what they need to do to protect our young people that are alive. Something that's sometimes missing from the conversation on these staggering statistics about our young people and their risk of suicide is that all of that is because of the social discrimination against their identity. Alone, queer and trans people are vibrant, joyful. We know who we are. We're proud to be who we are. Our young people know and are proud to be who they are. Those increased suicide risks are because of family rejection, religious trauma, being unsafe in schools, with GLSEN reports out year after year that schools continue to be unsafe for LGBTQ young people, with those staggering double and sometimes triple statistics for trans and non-binary youth. So the part that I want to drive home that we see day to day in a space that is catered and centered to celebrate queer and trans joy is that it exists without the pressure of the cis hetero social way in which we live that says that this is a wrong way to be. So the real life impact is if you let queer and trans people exist, particularly our trans and non-binary youth, there wouldn't be, it isn't that it's inherently harmful to be who you are. It's that's up against not being able to get jobs, not being able to have a place to sleep. We work with unhoused young people who are kicked out of their homes for their identity. More than half of the youth we serve are trans and non-binary. So what I see of that real world impact is that they feel what's being already told to them through our media, through the way in which we already exist in a binary world. So I am so frightened that we will continue to lose young people because of ignorance and actual untruths. Sex is also not as binary as we think that it is, in the way that gender isn't as binary.
They're being othered. Lots of groups are being othered by this administration and by people on the right. It is a tactic that is often used on many different fronts and always used by authoritarian strongmen and dictators. In fact, one of the first trans health clinics in the world was one of the very first targets of German Nazis in pre-World War II Berlin. You combine these orders and the unfounded characterizations being made in some circles of trans people as being terrorists or groomers or mentally unwell, and you have a recipe for violence. In fact, GLAAD studies show that far from being dangerous, it is trans people who are 4 times more likely to be victims of a crime than to be perpetrators of a crime. Is this opening the door and giving permission to more of that, Sarah?
Yes, and we've seen that. There's something that we talk about, and GLAAD's research is important. They talk about visibility, but visibility does not equal safety. Visibility sometimes has made our young trans people more unsafe because it hasn't been matched with equal rights. So I do believe that that's what we're opening doors to, clearly focused on our young people, but for our entire community, it's really scary and quite dangerous.
So Trump has called on the federal government to monitor the influence that K through 12 curriculum and instructed the Secretary of Education, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Health and Human Services to work with the Attorney General to enforce, quote, patriotic education. Orion, how does this fit in with his other directive to eliminate funding for schools that promote, quote, indoctrination based on, quote, gender ideology and discriminatory equity ideology?
Right. So this is all part of how federal agencies are being asked to fulfill the administration's viewpoint that trans and non-binary people don't exist. And the policies we're seeing implemented, including this one for K through 12 schools, is following a playbook we've seen in states for several years. Like we've been building up to this moment, especially through Florida's Don't Say Gay law. Folks probably remember that, even if you don't live in Florida. So where part of where this policy comes from, it comes from pushes in red states like Florida to eliminate references to LGBTQ people in school curriculums. This policy in the Department of Education is so noteworthy, though, because I spoke with several former staffers at the Education Department who worked there under Biden in the Office for Civil Rights, and they educated me a lot on how outside of normal this is, that the Department of Education is not actually supposed to set curriculum for any schools. That's supposed to be a state and local decision. And Trump actually campaigned on returning the Education Department back to the states, but instead, his administration has mandated that all K through 12 schools change their curriculum to remove references to trans and LGBTQ people.
And of course, the funding, the federal government's participation in education is for funding. And I suppose if you don't follow through, as he has said in several of these other executive orders, that your funding is at risk. And therein lies the rub. Ames, could moves like these awaken, could there be a silver lining? Could they awaken others to what some have called, quote, unprecedented interferences into our education system and ultimately benefit the very people he's trying to hurt, transgender and LGBTQ folks? Could there be a backlash?
I think it might be more instructive to think about the way that the current presidential administration is going after marginalized people, trans people, yes, but also people who are seeking abortion, also immigrants, any number of people who are, low income and reliant upon government programs. I think what this shows is that the federal government is not going to stop with trans and non-binary people. The policing, the gender policing that these executive orders call forth is something that hurts everybody. This kind of increased surveillance by the government. We've seen also this unprecedented access to sensitive information at the IRS, at the Social Security Administration, that I think should be alarming to everybody. Like this, we're trans people are not trying to be your canaries in a coal mine, and we should think about the bigger strategy here.
And that is my next question. Sarah, gay rights have made significant leaps forward toward acceptance and equality. This is obviously a step backward, which is how most things move forward in this country. Two steps forward, one step back. Do you think policymakers who are pushing for these changes think of them as separate from the advancements made for gay rights in particular, or is just simply the opening salvo and they're going after the rest of them later?
Yeah, I do think that. I think that there has been a historical desire for incremental change, right? If we get something for LGBT people, let's take it, and then we'll bring trans people along. And I think that that happened with protections for equal rights and job discrimination and with marriage, right? But something that we're really missing from this conversation is intersection, right? There are trans gay people, right? That there are when we talk about the things that Ames mentioned that impacting multiple communities, we are everywhere. I have a sticker that says we are everywhere because LGBTQ people exist across the spectrum of every issue being impacted. So I don't believe that we are able to do that anymore, segment out what areas we think we can move forward. And I hope that the LGBTQ movement together continues to bring that forward, that idea that we
There
can't.
are billionaire LGBTQ people surrounding Donald Trump and
Right.
supporting Donald Trump and
Yes.
giving him money to run his previous
Yes.
campaign, and who are influencing and informing his administration. How do you explain that when you look at what we're talking about this morning?
Well, because, right, when I say we are everywhere, I also mean that there are also people that I don't agree with that are in my community, right? There are LGBTQ people who are driven by money, who we've seen change positions because of their proximity to power, because whiteness in our society is winning over protecting people that don't already have access to that wealth and that power. And I do think that that is what we're seeing.
Orion.
Uh, I really appreciate Sarah's points, and I just wanted to add, if the Trump administration did follow through on all of Project 2025's policies for trans and LGBTQ people, then services for LGBTQ plus Americans would be decimated. Like, trans people are not, as far as Project 2025 goes, the attacks on trans people are part of a much bigger picture, because Project 2025 wants to reinforce a heterosexual, biblically based family wherever possible.
Handmaid's Tale. So, Trump has called for halting the use of federal money to support gender affirming medical care for transgender youth under the age of 19. That means no money for puberty blocking drugs, no money for hormone therapy or gender affirming surgery, which is rare, by the way, for minors, I'm told. But when this order is fully implemented, it would cut off government health insurance for these otherwise probably unaffordable treatments. A judge has blocked that order for the moment until the end of this month, I think the 27th of February, if I'm not mistaken. But what will that mean if this goes through, Ames, for those already in the transition process? What will it mean for those contemplating it? What will that mean for those who have already transitioned, who require some of these drugs for their existence?
To give an overly legal answer, it depends, right? On like exactly what the contours of regulations look like that try to remove federal funding. It's important to say that federal funding is something that is typically controlled by the Congress and not by the president. Having said that, don't have any faith in the current U.S. House and Senate that they would try to stop any rollback of federal funding. I think, if anything, when the president signals that this is a law he wants them to pass, that they will probably do that. If the administration acts to change the conditions of participation in Medicare and Medicaid, that could be really disastrous for healthcare providers in our country. Even there are very few hospitals and healthcare systems that are not reliant upon Medicare and Medicaid funding. So if the entire federal funding is contingent upon whether this particular transgender healthcare is rendered, that could be that's sort of a nuclear option that would, yeah, Sarah, I know wants to jump in.
Sarah, go ahead.
I
Very
just
quickly.
want to add that in North Carolina, we already had the SB 808 that was a gender affirming care ban to block care for minors under 18. But what that has is a caveat that if you are already accessing hormones or you're on puberty blockers with the support of your family and your doctor, you can continue them. And I think we should all be scared that there's an order talking about 19-year-olds, because then we're getting into telling adults what kind of care that they can have. And that goes against what I said already, all medical associations that say that this is supportive care when prescribed. So that's already a fear that
Telling adults what they can do medically doesn't seem to be an impediment to certain people on the right. In writing about this in the 19th, Orion, you reported on Omar Gonzalez Pagan, senior counsel and healthcare strategist for Lambda Legal. That's the nation's largest LGBTQ plus legal group, asserting that, quote, the federal government, particularly this administration, has no right to insert itself into conversations and decision-making that rightly belongs only to patients, their families, and their medical providers. If the courts agree, could what they decide here also apply to abortion restrictions or morning after pill restrictions or vice versa?
Right, that's an argument that trans advocates have been making for a while, that restrictions on gender affirming care restrict the same kind of bodily autonomy of abortion, and that in the state level anti-trans bills, we've seen that the strategies follow anti-abortion playbook. In terms of how the administration could further restrict abortion, I mean, after Dobbs, abortion already is illegal in a lot of states, depending on the state, like the certain trimester of it, where it would be happening. So, and I would also question how committed Trump is to restricting abortion, because he has waffled on it pretty consistently. But I would also note, in terms of your earlier question of what does this look like, it means trans people in states like New York, Massachusetts, and Virginia are losing care, but folks in states like North Carolina are not losing care because laws already exist, like Sarah said.
And I suppose there could be a danger that this would be some Supreme Court decision that would kick it to the states to decide. We'd have a situation like the end of Roe. Orion Rummler is an LGBTQ plus reporter for the 19th News. Sarah Mikhail with Time Out Youth. She's the CEO, and Ames Simmons, senior lecturing fellow at Duke University School of Law. Thank you all for the hour.
Charlotte Talks is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte. Our executive producer is